Energy Network for those of you who have not met before. And this week, just to make sure you're in the right room, I'm pleased to be joined by Jose Maria Valenzuela, who will be looking at state intervention in energy markets. So Jose is a research fellow here at the Institute for Science, Innovation and Society in the School of Anthropology, which is what I love about the Energy Network. We reach widely across all the disciplines in the university. You're also Oxford Net Zero Fellow and a non-resident fellow of the Energy for Growth Hub. My understanding. So I would say you work on governance and regulation of climate technologies and electricity decarbonisation. So I don't know if that means you don't touch gas, but
yeah,
some people use energy and electricity interchangeably, but you're very clear it's electricity. And your work on electricity governance received the Gian Domenico Mahone Prize on Regulatory Governance at the European Consortium of Political Research. Sounds cool. Previously, you worked in Mexico's Department of Energy and you consulted for UNIDO, UNET, and the US Department of Energy, NREL, on industrial transformation. And your DPhil was public policy here at the Lausanne School. And you've recently conducted comparative research in Europe, China, and Latin American electricity markets. But I'm hoping we're going to hear a little bit more about the UK as well today.
Yes, exactly.
So I look forward to hearing more. Jose, it's you.
Thank you. So thank you for having me here. I always love joining this seminar, even though it's always very complicated with all the agendas in Oxford. As Robin introduced, I'm a senior research fellow at the Institute of Science, Innovation and Society at the Department of Anthropology and Museum Ethnography. But the institute is it's an interdisciplinary research center. My background is rather in political science and international relations. And I'm going to talk today about centralization, state intervention, and the way that influence over the development of the electricity industry has changed or is changing in multiple countries. I'm going to focus a lot on the UK because of the audience, but also because we've been doing some really interesting research. I think UK is kind of what we call a kind of an exceptional case in the sense that we all see the UK as the utmost liberalization example, right? So if we can see centralization, state intervention growing in the most liberal case, then there's kind of something else going on that's worth looking at. So that's why I'm going to talk much more about the UK here. But as I say, really, I work on low emission electricity, but since we work on regulation in many different aspects of climate change, I'm also working on marine carbon removal and urban carbon removal, which it's a little bit wider scope of work, but ultimately it's about understanding how regulation gets made, who gets to say what the regulation looks like, specifically where there's a lot of technological change. There's a lot of uncertainty on new technological couplings. It's not about the technology, but about how the technology integrates into existing physical and institutional systems. And today I'm going to kind of push back on the discussion and kind of the narratives on decentralization, right? Not because it's wrong itself. I think there's many technical things that we discuss in this seminar on and on that really talk about decentralization. Decision making is done increasingly at lower levels of the system. I mean, and kind of the ultimate case is at the kind of the appliance or EV level, right? Like when we can actively, strategically interact with the grid at these levels, then it's truly a decentralization process. But I think we should be very careful when we think about decentralization and assume that this has some kind of intimate association with specific forms of governing the energy system. And this is a paper that I kind of bring as a good example. And I also bring it because I know the authors and they're good friends, but I disagree with them in the way that they frame kind of decentralization as a result of a technological process, which is digitalization, mediated by institutional processes like deregulation. So they say, well, you know, digitalization supports deregulation, which drives decentralization. And the story that I'm going to give today, it's actually completely the reverse and the opposite, where centralization and more state control actually might lead to decarbonization, maybe also to decentralization, actually, in other forms, kind of at the technology level, but not at an institutional level. Well, digitalization is not going to be a part of the presentation, but maybe we can discuss it further down the road. So what the method that I follow, as I said, I'm a social scientist of kind of the political science type. So my type of political science really relies a lot on history, documental evidence, review of policy processes, what we call institutional analysis, which is essentially understanding what organizations there are, how they talk to each other, who talks to each other within the organizations, a lot of interviews, a lot of documental evidence to understand who talks to whom, why they talk, in what circumstances they talk, and what we call kind of process tracing to figure out when decisions are made, under what circumstances, and to try to use this to explain what's behind the process that we are interested in, which in this case, and this is essentially the argument, is to link the technological piece, like my colleagues saying, digitalization leads to deregulation, leads to decentralization. In this case, what I identified to be relevant variables that I've come across the several pieces of work that I'm going to be presenting include the particular economics of low carbon technologies, renewables and nuclear, like the fact that they need to have really long-term, decades long-term revenue certainty, for example. This is very particular to these technologies, and not only to these technologies, but definitely this is a defining feature of these technologies. There's a lot of uncertainty on technology coupling, and this is, we really don't know if the UK is going to require a lot of hydrogen or a lot of electricity, right? For a long time, we've been talking about a surge in electricity demand from EVs, for example, but the reality is that electricity demand keeps falling in the UK. So clearly, there's a lot of uncertainty kind of at the system level. And there's also new expectations of public accountability, not only kind of the geopolitical crisis coming out of the invasion of Ukraine and increasing energy prices, but it's also obviously kind of the political commitment to achieve net zero and the public support for those type of commitments. Those create new forms of, or new types of public pressure and needs for accountability. So you're gonna see much more details about this while I present. But essentially, these are some of the underlying conditions that lead to new forms of political centralization, which is what I'm going to talk to you about. And the argument here is that we need to be attentive of how decentralization is happening. Academically, simply because it's interesting itself, but also because we need to engage with this type of debates on institutional design, rather than simply assuming that the technology is moving and things are going to decentralize. Someone is going to take some decision out there, when it's really government agencies that are taking the decisions. So then let's go through the UK history first, and then I'll use other cases to contrast the UK to show you why we think these conclusions are relevant. And I'm going to move from the I to the we, because I've been collaborating with different colleagues in different parts of the research. And the first one is a collaboration with John Rhys. Some of you might know him. He's been a long-time participant in energy research within Oxford. And what we argued in this paper is that, we realized that, or we document how state coordination has been growing at a kind of and relegating other traditional instruments of liberalized markets in investment decisions in the electricity industry. And this is something that is barely speaked about. I think the most, the best example that I have about how little discussion this has in the UK, and the UK is not the only case, is talking to a really high-level official at the department at BASE or DESCENT, and said, well, I think this thing that you are doing, and we'll go back to that in a minute, said, I think this is a nationalization. And he would say, well, it is a nationalization, but we would never call it like that, right? So, it is happening, but, it's hard to name it the way that we should name it. So let me give you kind of a hint of how we think about these new forms of centralization. This is kind of an abbreviated history of the electricity industry in the 20th century, in a way, or the post-war history of electricity industry. First, we had the state-owned company. Then we kind of separated the function of policy and regulation and the business operation part of it, maybe for privatizing it. But in countries where things didn't get privatized, still there was kind of this growing distinction between what's policy and what's operation. So you could still have this even if you didn't privatize the industry. And then what we say is that right now we are in a phase where we are seeing the emergence of hybrid organizations. These are organizations that have a business operation mandate, but that also have a policy and regulation mandate. And these have become much more salient in the governance of electricity in general, but particularly because of the growth of renewables. So this is the concrete example of the UK, right? Like we started with the Central Authority, Electricity Authority, back then Department on Trade and Industry, I believe, yeah. I mean, which at some point became DEC, at some point became the base, at some point later after we submitted the article, it became DECEN. But the interesting thing here is, we start seeing this type of hybrid organizations here, and I'll speak a little bit more about it. The Low Carbon Contract Company or the Climate Change Commission. But I'll actually focus much more on the Low Carbon Contract Company. We also grew kind of specializing on regulation. That's there. There hasn't been too much happening there. But what's interesting here is that this NG stands for National Grid. Obviously, the Central Electricity Generating Board split into electricity generation companies and the transmission companies. But what's interesting here is that the National Grid has progressively had these spin-offs that are sometimes very little known to definitely people outside the electricity industry. They would not have no knowledge of their existence. Elexon, which I define as essentially the owner of all the transaction data in the electricity system, which is required for the economic settlements, but the actual data is owned by Elexon. Or they are the guardians of the data rather than the owners, and the energy system operator, which at some point in the near future is going to be called the future systems operator.
Where the national energy system operator is taking gas and hydrogen on board.
On board, yeah. Well, what the latest reform, they decided to integrate more energy vectors into their remit. But what's interesting here is that these are essentially operating actors, right? The system operator, I mean, it's not only because it's on the name, but it's actually an integrated piece of the daily operation of the system. We would not assume them as policymakers or regulators, but in practice they are. They have a lot of remit to define policy, less policy, but definitely a lot of regulation is decided in practice or formally by the energy system operator. So I think these two are really good examples of how we have these new actors that have these mixed roles and are essentially public, either because they've been created like the Low Carbon Contract Company as a fully state-owned company to administrate all the contracts for different contracts. And the history, I'm not sure how familiar you are with this history, but when the government decided to create a contract for difference, a lot of companies say, well, we could sign contracts with every market participant that's going to buy from us, but that's very risky. We'll prefer if we buy it from a state-owned entity. And then a conservative government created a state-owned company to administrate these contracts. And the case of the energy system operator, and we'll see it in a minute, it's also very interesting because it has progressively moved from being a private entity owned by the National Grid, first within the National Grid, and it's progressively moving towards becoming kind of a state agency, really, not nationalized, So let me, sorry, it's a public company. So let me show you a little bit of a comparison of what that means in a more international context, specifically for the system operator. So there was a time where the system operators in these three countries, including Mexico, Chile, and the UK, were part of a public integrated utility, right? There was no differentiated in that case. Then Chile and the UK, Chile first, actually, the first national jurisdiction to liberalize. Then the UK moved they split and privatized different segments of the industry, and the system operator was part of a transmission company that was private. Then Chile in 2016, they nationalized the system operator. And the UK kind of had this middle step where they changed the license of the national grid to make the system operator a little bit more independent. They kind of built walls where there were doors in their building, create entry through the different doors, etc., etc. But then ultimately, even the national grid thought that it didn't make sense for them to somehow still be involved. And everyone agreed that it was better to make them to move them into some form of public ownership. Mexico did something. Mexico without going through the Mexico without going through the private liberalization process simply split up the system operator from its own state-owned electricity transmission company. So Mexico has a state-owned transmission company and a state-owned system operator without this step. So I just think it's interesting to think of how, through different means, authorities have relied on these actors in this way. And let me say a little bit more of why this, interestingly, politically and institutionally, it's not only that they're kind of unbundled from a transmission company, is that when they become unbundled from the transmission company, they become closer to the central government. And this is how I would represent it in a kind of simplified way. Kind of the classical depiction of regulatory relations essentially tells you, you have the government, you have a regulator, and then you have the target industry, which in this case might be the transmission companies or generation companies. This is the traditional way of building it. If we integrate the system operator into kind of into our perspective, the system operator that's part of a transmission company would be behind the wall of the transmission company, right? When they become unbundled from the transmission company, it's not like they simply become independent of everyone. They're actually not independent, fully independent from everyone. They become closer to the government. So that means that the governments have much more opportunity to literally talk to them directly. And this has a substantial impact on the capabilities of the government to make decisions. They can get information directly from the system operator. They don't need to ask the regulator to ask information from the private company and then move it back, et cetera, et cetera. And they can even ask the system operator to adopt some regulatory functions, like, for example, monitoring or even rulemaking. And we can go a little bit into more detail. So this creates two interesting questions that I'm gonna cover in the next few slides. And one is whether this really has a substantial impact on how policy is implemented, specifically for renewables. And kind of one implication of this diagram is that it would seem here that the regulator becomes less important, right? Because the government can ask the regulator to do something or for some information, but it could also ask the system operator for that same information or for that function. So in a way, when we think of kind of these network theories, make the government more central and the regulator less central or less important when we think about flows of information. So before answering kind of the empirical findings that we got from those two puzzling issues, let me finish saying some things about the empirical case of the UK or the historical case of the UK. So as I mentioned with John Rhys, we kind of reached these two conclusions. We are seeing a lot re-regulation, kind of the growth of regulation, but not only that, but also more state coordination. And maybe this is kind of more natural. It's essentially just the state regulates more and it becomes more intrusive through regulation. Price control, regulator, asset-based remuneration, it's increasingly used. And I think this is particularly interesting, the segmentation of markets, that the state essentially says, well, it's not that I'm going to have this set of regulation for this market. I'm actually going to come in and through regulation, create independent markets. Let's say like a market for long-term renewable or clean energy contracts and a market for fossil fuel-based or battery-based balancing market, which is one of the kind of leading proposals for market reform. The players here are kind of very traditional, the department and Ofgem, even though we need to remember that for a long time, until DEC existed in 2008, for a really long time, there was no Department of Energy, really. But I think it's more interesting to think about the state coordination, because that's the new novel element of the governance. We have CFD area plannings, that is, so for example, offshore wind projects are not located just anywhere offshore. Someone orchestrates the process for defining these areas, in this case, the Crown States. We have new kind of future thinking instruments like the future energy scenarios. And there's obviously new offshore coordination mechanisms for not only to develop offshore wind farms, but also to interconnect them and to expand interconnection with on land. And then here we have not only the traditional department, but now we have the system operator becoming more independent too, like an actor in itself, the low carbon contract company, and the Crown Estates, which for those that don't know, it's essentially the part of the government that's responsible, or it's the owner of sovereign possessions like the continental shelf, and therefore it's also the manager of the licenses of the continental shelf rights that are needed to develop offshore wind farms. So they become kind of really critical actors within the energy system as well. And the point here is that these are all government actors making decisions across the system. So hopefully I'll convince you that there's something kind of interesting and different in the UK. And now I can tell you more about how this looks beyond the UK. But I think there's a question here. Yeah. 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 Yeah, so from kind of the theoretical perspective here is that the government needs the regulator to govern the country. So then if the regulator says we cannot do A, B, or C, the government essentially has to agree with the regulator, because the regulator knows better, essentially. That's the idea. Like the regulator has, in practice, quite a lot of scope to decide what they can do or cannot do. And the idea is that if you have a second player with also really good information about the industry, probably even better information, then the government can ask the system operator, what do you think about this policy that the regulator says that we cannot implement? Or the other way around, actually, it could also work the other way around, where the system operator says, like, no, we shouldn't do this. It's gonna be too messy for the electricity system. It's gonna create too many risks. And then can go to the regulator and say, what do you think about what the system operator said? And their own experts are gonna probably have a different opinion, and the government can choose who to kind of support. And the idea here is that the more information the government can access through different means, the more autonomy the government has to make those decisions.
They're never going to be the technical consultation that Ofgem do for, even if they have all of this, a lot of information. There's only so much they can do.
So I would put it like this: do you agree that it's possible that the government and Ofgem might disagree on a topic? So it is also possible for Ofgem to say, we have more technical expertise. We know what we are telling you. You're going to tell us to do otherwise. But if there's someone else with the same or more technical expertise, they could also rely on that. And I'm going to show you the last slides are about the marginalization of the regulator, and where we actually find how the regulator in the UK has decided not to do more when asked to do more, and the government had to turn to the system operator to do some of this work. So I'll go back to this idea. So I'll go back to the UK case, to this specific question at the end. But in the meantime, I'm gonna talk about a paper that should come out maybe this week or next week, because it's already been accepted. It's kind of in a final editorial process, which is essentially based a lot of our understanding on the UK and other markets. We try to understand whether this was happening across multiple markets that are very different. The UK is obviously a very liberalized, it's one of the most liberalized markets. Mexico, as I said, is somewhere intermediate. There's kind of a wholesale market, there's no retail markets, there's a dominant state-owned company. So it's literally in between in many dimensions, and Morocco still has a state-owned utility. So we say, okay, so let's see how this works across these markets. I want to focus on Mexico and UK for because of time, but I can go back to the Morocco case if you want. And here we rely on a kind of more conventional distinction between the liberalization or the kind of neoliberal approach of energy governance and this new interventionist approach. And we really push the kind of the idea. So like, do we really see renationalization? Do we really see a big regulatory expansion? Do we really see the government directly intervening into policy decisions that would otherwise be delegated to technical competent regulatory agencies like Ofgem or other regulatory agencies? And so like, if we actually see, like the government taking decisions directly, we really see this regulatory expansion and renationalization. Then these are kind of very clear signs that this is actually happening. So we take a policy instrument approach, and by this we mean like we focus not on the whole system, but we focus on a specific policy instruments to decide how generation is built up, to see if this has been evolving. And what's interesting here in this approach is that it allows us to actually stack policy instruments together, right? We can have a wholesale market, and on top of the wholesale market, we can have renewable energy quotas, obviously, or we could have feed-in tariff, or we could have auctions, right? Like governments can choose what to stack on. And the important thing is this allows us some flexibility to say, well, maybe the backbone is the wholesale market, and there's very little intervention and nationalization, et cetera, et cetera. But what we see is that with renewable energy auctions, the level of interventions is very, very high. And this gives us kind of another type of perspective. So what we see is that what we call the first package of renewable energy policy support, quotas and feed-in tariffs, really require very little intervention on issues that get regulated. So the government decides, volume and technologies. They kind of single down technologies and choose how much generation from that technology should be deployed, or the other way around. I guess in importance, they choose certain technologies and say how much they are going to get for this technology. But with renewable energy auctions, the decisions are much wider. The government or government agencies decide on volume, technology. If you consider the crown state's involvement, even location, off-taker, if you consider the low carbon contract company as the government agency, and the fact that there's also a requirement of local value chain integration. And the other interesting thing is that most of this is decided by the ministry, right? Not the regulatory agency. Which was the case for the quotas and the feed-in tariffs. So again, obviously this gives a much more nuanced perspective, right? It's not that the whole system has become more kind of state-run, is that one component of the system has become more state-run, but the backbone is still kind of very traditional. And this is an argument that you can pursue or we could pursue. So for the case of Mexico, it's a little bit more complicated. Because we had a major, the UK, we started since the wholesale market reform. In Mexico, because the reform happened only last kind of 10 years ago, we actually are able to capture the single buyer model, that had a lot of issues where the government intervened on deciding volume, technology, location, off-taker. And this is literally the Ministry of Finance or the Ministry of Energy making these choices on behalf or participating with the utility and making these choices. There was a wheeling subsidy for renewable energies where the only thing that was decided was the price of the wheeling subsidy, essentially a very subsidized wheeling tariff. And then with the markets, there's only one issue, which is the state-owned company as an off-taker. But as we move into the other new instruments, renewable energy certificates, it's actually not very regulated. It's only volume. And renewable energy auctions in Mexico are less regulated than in the UK, actually. There's only the volume, the location, partially the location, and the off-taker. So there's three issues being regulated here rather than 5. But ultimately, it's again the ministry and not the regulatory agency who's deciding on these renewable energy support schemes, right? So the important thing to consider here is that this is not like a technological necessity. It's not that renewable energy auctions have to be run by ministries everywhere. It's not that renewable actions need to have kind of these location criteria everywhere. You could run it just like Mexico has no technology criteria. They actually allow any form of technology participate in their long-term contracts, even fossil fuels. But obviously for fossil fuels, they wouldn't take a 20-year kind of a contract because it would be too risky because of the fossil fuel prices. So they don't regulate technology. So all of these elements are things that you can take in and out. So it's not there's nothing about the technology that defines what do you do and how do you run the auctions. So we're working on a paper on auctions if you want to discuss more of that. But then I moved to this issue of the marginalization of regulator, which is probably the most contested, and this is also the most contested argument that we made. And this is also a piece of work that I'm developing with my colleague Emmanuelle Matthieu from the University of Lausanne in Switzerland to protect consumers. So essentially, the regulator says, like, okay, guys, there's too much to do. We're going to focus on what we should really do, which is protecting consumers. Anything else is not our role to do. So they essentially rejected these new roles. So then the government starts saying, like, well, maybe we can ask the system operator to do this, and then they start with the future system scenarios, and then they start asking them more and more, and then we are in this kind of snowball where people expect more from the system operator becomes more public, we need them to be more public, now we can ask them more things. And I mean, this is the point at which we are right now, where the government keeps asking the system operator to do more things, and therefore requires the system operator to become more public, etc., as a different entity than Ofgem, where and then that allows Ofgem to really focus on the work that they think they can do better, which is on tariffs, on price controls, and etc. So in a way, to go back to the question, it's not that the regulator lost importance. It's just that the topics of energy governance have expanded, and the regulator has stayed with its remit, which is okay. And now there's more actors that are also playing important roles within the system. So that's how we think of the changing role of the regulator in the UK. So we really enjoy this, and this really opens up what we think it's going to be a very active discussion throughout this decade on the changing nature of regulators across markets. So Mexico the Mexican president just sent many proposals, but one of them is to reduce the autonomy of the regulator and to essentially make it a kind of a technical independent office, but within the kind of technical independence, but not politically or administrative independent from the ministry, under the idea that a lot of these similar issues are coming up, and they think that conflicts between the regulator and the ministry are stalling the country, and therefore one has to lose, and the regulator has essentially to lose its autonomy and its power to contradict the government, to the ministry, essentially. So I can say more about the Mexican case and other cases where this is interesting. But for now, I'll just say that, you know, it is time, like turbulent times on regulatory issues in the energy sector, obviously. There's also a lot of opportunities for like really creative reimagination of institutional designs. And we've seen that happening in the UK, definitely in other countries. And yeah, it's something worth keep an eye on. So thank you.
Very much indeed, Jose. Also for picking up questions earlier on. I would even argue that in the case of Ofgem, if they had a sole job to protect the consumer, that was nationalised as well, because price caps were introduced and so on, and that was taken out of their hands. So there is a real question to me of how you can have a national energy policy that doesn't take the consumer into account foremost, because we don't have an industrial policy to base it on at the moment. So where do you start it from? What's the premise for what you're trying to deliver? Is it the consumer's interest? For me, that's one of the questions of how you build it. It's what are you building it around? And is it international competitiveness, lowest cost, lowest carbon energy? Is it lowest cost to consumers? Is it lowest environmental impact? I'm not convinced we even have the answer to some of those questions, because we didn't introduce the decarbonisation of the electricity system as a legal requirement. It's just framed by what the CCC say should happen. So I just feel we're still uncoupled from what the main delivery mechanism is trying to achieve. So have you any comment about the different national governments and what their overall objective is?
Yeah, so first of all, I think our research make us biased towards putting too much emphasis on the decarbonization dimension, and as if this was the main priority of the government, which might or might not be. I think only in the late stage of our research did we come across the issue of consumer protection or in the debates with Ofgem. So yeah, so that's on the UK, and I agree there's not a clear kind of guiding post in the UK. But it is true that for other countries, not only is there, I mean, it might also be puzzling, but there might also be conflicting issues. And I think the case of Mexico is interesting in that sense, because when the government liberalized in 2013-14, the main goal was to reduce prices for industry, essentially, for large industry, to make Mexico more competitive, to kind of finally take it out of a very slow growth trajectory. And that required any means needed to be used to get much more investment to arrive to the country, even if the government or state-owned companies had to take really long risky bets on allowing them to. So, for example, the government decided, as the electricity company, which was an electricity company, to become also a fossil fuel company, and become the largest supplier of gas in the country. And this is taking into account that Mexico has a state-owned company on the oil sector that traditionally supplied or produced gas and imported some gas. So now this electricity company became one of the top 10 commercializers of gas in all of North America. So that's huge. So I would say, for example, in that case, that the policy back then was decarbonization is not really relevant. Instead of, we don't care making our electricity company depend much more on fossil fuels, which is kind of contrary to what you would expect utilities direction, right? Because of decarbonization. Now the current government is not prioritizing decarbonization either. It's kind of prioritizing consumer protection, but and because the government is willing to subsidize electricity consumers at different rates, but actually it's a substantial amount, then the focus is how do we get the state utility to get the cheapest electricity available. And that, in part, this distinction this conflict between the regulator and the ministry come from those two different moments, political moments, when the priority was to get cheap electricity for the industry. Then you could have all of this regulation where the point was to allow the large consumers to get the cheapest electricity from the market. Now it's the other way, and it's like, how do the government wants to make sure that they can force all the cheap electricity to sell to the state-owned company so that they can reduce electricity prices for the general public. And the regulator, I mean, kind of the current rules don't really allow for that to happen. So that, I mean, this is not really positive, right? Like the story of decarbonization is not really that central. But maybe, I mean, Morocco is a case where the story is a little bit more positive because, and it also shows that for countries that don't have liberal markets, decarbonization is not a prerequisite. Because Morocco said, they essentially had this state-owned company that runs on mostly imported fossil fuels, and then they create a renewable agency to help the government procure new projects like essentially PPAs on renewables, and they've been very successful in both creating kind of a pipeline of projects. I mean, it's not a very robust pipeline because it's a very small energy system, but like some big projects and to create jobs along them. And I think they kind of figure out a slow but good pace way of decarbonization. And I think they are the ones that have this idea also more it's more critical to their logic of state intervention.
Okay, apologies for jumping in with a big question at the beginning there, but just waiting for everyone else to formulate their questions. Charlie, have you got something you want to raise?
I did have a question. We had an interesting talk a few weeks ago in this series from someone from Renewable UK talking about all of the wind projects onshore, but increasingly offshore, that are held up in a kind of queue waiting for access to transmission infrastructure. And I'm just wondering, and in the context of that talk, he was talking about the lack of seeming capacity to strategically allocate resource to building out transmission infrastructure in areas that we know we need to harvest for renewables. And I'm wondering whether that's somehow bound up in this story that you're telling about the sort of blurring of the traditional competencies between regulator, government, and system operator.
Yeah, I think this is a really good question because this is one of those areas where there's conflict arising between the government and the regulator. So the regulator has a very clear mandate of protecting consumers, among other things, through only approving projects that make economic sense. Right? You don't want consumers to be paying for excessive investment in transmission capacity. And then the choice of what's too much and what's too little, it's actually very hard to make. So the regulator on its own mandate, and they say it, they always prefer to lean on the idea that there's going to be less infrastructure required. And there's one really interesting case on a distribution level, where now that the regulator is asking distribution companies to use future energy scenarios to develop their own business cases, companies are coming and say, well, I'll use the scenario that requires the most investment to make my case of how much I'm going to invest and how much I should get paid from the consumers, right? And then the regulator says, well, no, actually, we'll use the low investment scenario that also gets us to net zero, but with less investment because there's going to be more consumer change. And that's what we're going to prove to you as a feasible revenue. And the companies went to the courts, and the courts essentially told the regulator that you have to figure out a better way to make these decisions. So that's also happening. That's happening in a different way at transmission level. But I would claim that the new government policies on grid coordination planning and the growing roles of the system, the expectation is that the system operator is going to be able to do more integrated grid expansion plans that are going to be more official and therefore should be able to go through regulatory approval faster without the regulator having to make the tough choices. Essentially saying, the system operator already gone through the numbers, we can trust the system operator, so we can approve them. So that's how I would describe the situation right now. So yeah, it is very, and I understand the UK government not wanting to take the responsibility themselves on this parliamentary system and kind of the UK tradition, and also unable to kind of ask the system operator to officially take the responsibility. So right now it's kind of a shared responsibility between the planner that should sort out all the technical information, evaluation issues, and the regulator having to ultimately keep making the approval decisions on tariffs that are essential.
Just before I come to you, Nick Eyre online pointed out when Ofgem were offered the system architect role, they had 2 engineers on the payroll, so the capacity to do anything wasn't there. So that could technically be the reason why they refused, just not having the team of people in place. But he had a quick question, which was, so the evolving role of the DNOs, the distribution network operators, moving into system operators in their own rights, how does that fit into this overall move away from a regulated environment to one which is being controlled more centrally?
Yeah, I have to say that I want to think more about that, because my expectation a few years ago was that the system operator was gonna go down the level and become and control more things further down and down and down, and that didn't happen. Right, the story was different. It's the system of the distribution operators that are taking this control role. So therefore, kind of that threw me off. So I really need to consider that. But in other countries, that's what's happening. In Chile, in Mexico, that's what's happening. The national system operator is increasingly going down and down and controlling more and more and more. So, for example, batteries. There's much more control happening at lower levels.
But my understanding is there's a lot to be gained from local balancing, which the system operator nationally didn't even look at. So the flow management that reduces the need for interconnects is a tension with what's happening on the transmission network, maybe.
Yeah, so I'm going to look into that this year with Ronan Bolton at Edinburgh. So maybe we can invite him to speak about this. Yeah, I think for the organizations, there's kind of an organizational structure issue. So, for example, I didn't knew that Ofgem only had 2 engineers, but essentially you would have to get more resources you would have to get more resources approved to do that work, and there's always friction in terms of funding allocation. So you always have to start doing the job before you get the money. So for organization, that's always hard. I think in the UK there's an interesting story about some organizations actually fighting to grow, and this would be kind of an expectation from the literature, is that organizations always want to grow, and that's why Ofgem saying I don't want to be an architect was surprising to us as kind of political scientists, because there's another good example of organizations trying to kind of become bigger, and that example is the case of Elexon, which I mentioned as the manager of data in the electricity system. So Elexon was created more than 20 years ago, and when there were consultations on what should happen to the system operator, because Elexon was already a kind of a separate company itself, Elexon actually said that they wanted to become the system operator. They said, we already exist as a separate office. We are not actually in the same building. You can essentially transfer all the system operator, the control room, all of these guys into our organizational structure, and will become the system operator, which is not a crazy thing. Like usually in other markets that I've studied, the function of the information function of Elexon is part of the system operator function. That's usually how it's done. So kind of you could have both stories, and I think I don't have more insights on how this played out in these specific cases. But I mean, there's only the fact that Ofgem said, like, we don't want to be dealing with more issues right now. We are in a kind of precarious situation, but you could also have cases like Elexon saying, transfer them to us with all the money of functioning, and we'll do it better.
Can we go to Nick first, please?
Many of these are like the transmission lines and getting more access to grids and local distribution. They're quite long-term investments involved. How much is the government acknowledging this by saying, well, we must have cross-party agreement? Because, you know, for example, if somebody said, right, we're going to simplify the planning laws and put grids from Scotland down to the UK to get electricity fast. You don't obviously want 50 billion and then the next government just say no. Is there agreement there that some of this thing has to be done like defence on a cross-party basis?
You're not drawing parallels with any other major infrastructure rail projects, for example, are you, Nick? Sorry.
Yeah, that's I don't think I have insider answer. So I don't know if the current government. I mean, there's also a fact that throughout this time we have had so many conservative governments that the position might be different. But I think there is this progression from the notion that these choices are market-based and regulated. The regulator is the one that ultimately decides what goes or not, to the realization that there needs to be government involvement, and that's something very new. Like there's currently no indicative grid transmission plan, expansion plan. We're only going to have sometime in the future. So I think it's still kind of something that politicians are also learning about. Yeah.
The same target for the carbon budget. So it's a legal requirement.
I guess the point is it's decoupled, even though the overall budget exists, it's not linked to what, say, an electricity system has to deliver.
Transport that electricity. So that's probably not an area where you can tinker a lot with political decisions, I think. So
like decarbonisation of heat, for example, is a really key important, part of delivering that, but there's no national plan around that. Really,
yeah, exactly. So this sources of generation, I think you have more say over that, or how the electricity is used, but how you transport it to the system is always the same amount, or eventually the same amount that you're going to have to transport. So that's why I think those decisions are hopefully a bit more fixed. In terms of funding, I think the question you asked, I think that's a really interesting one, because so national grid, or rather the ESO, the electricity system operator, I think is funded through consumer bills. I'm sure.
Like cost. Okay.
Whereas Ofgem and the department are funded by Treasury directly. So I think those decisions made by Treasury are probably more political and you can kind of tinker with those more than with the decision on how you funded the ESO. So if you're a government who wants to kind of make things happen quicker, you probably have a bit more certainty relying on the ESO to deliver what you want, rather than on Ofgem, whose money could always be taken away by Treasury. So again, I think that's a really important question. I genuinely don't know the answer to it. It's just
this is a really, really useful way of seeing it. Like the fact that the frictions to get extra money for departments that need to get budget approval are, and you can see with system operators, you can see their budgets coming up and down, authorized by the regulator. We can see, at least for example, the Mexican system operator just got a reduction to its budget, quite a substantial, like 10 or 15%, because they had already designed the market. They had already done a lot of work, and they didn't need the extra money, so they actually took that away. So that means that they can also get it back when needed. Yeah. And that's from tariffs, regulated tariffs.
I was going to
relationship between government and regulator. Because in the round, if you look at it, I don't think Ofgem is lacking power. If anything, it feels like Ofgem is continuously accruing all sorts of roles that they didn't have in the past. And this all goes into assumptions that you and I make differently about what the role of the regulator should be in a system. And that's probably not a question that's been answered. Because I think if you ask Ofgem, long-standing civil servants who worked for Ofgem for 20, 30 years, they're going to say, what do you think the Ofgem role is? I think they're going to have a very strong role in economic regulation. And that's where they see the best value out of their organization. I think we regulate networks, we know exactly, we do price controls, basically, that's our bread and butter. And then they have another consumer mandate, consumer protection mandate as well, which is done jointly with government, as you said. But then if you look at it, at what they do, they've recently done a consultation on digitalization in the energy sector and consumer options for that. And they're getting involved very much in innovation as well, like what role for innovation they do, sandboxes for innovation as well. So their role is growing much more beyond these two core roles that they have as economic regulator and consumer protection body. So if you look at it in the round, they're not really losing power. But I completely agree with your conclusion that the system is expanding so much that the roles are being redrawn and new actors are in.
Yeah, I totally. I just we need to, if we think of the 1990s where there was Ofgem and nothing else, now Ofgem is just one more piece that has a very clear mandate on economic regulation and tariffs and approval of business models, which is essentially what innovation for Ofgem is, right? Like where they get new business models approved and so on.
And also hear that they feel that they cannot do some of the things they want to deliver without primary legislation. So they then go back to the legislator to ask for new powers. So again, it shows that some of the role that they would like to carry out is still limited by political influence, and maybe that's correct.
Ofgem asks for legislation for them to do something, it's because they don't want to then get judicially reviewed or challenged, and then it's harder for them to defend themselves. So it's easier if they have the backing of legislation. They can't get JR. So it goes to the legal risk appetite for an organization, and traditionally Ofgem has been very legally risk averse.
I was going to suggest maybe we'll bring the formal questions to a close now, but
Yeah.
first of all, let's thank Jose one more time. There's not going to be a seminar next week, but in a fortnight's time, Malcolm McCulloch will be talking about systems thinking. So I hope some of you can make it next time, but no seminar next week.
Just in case.
Okay. Thank you.